and welcome to the MISEM podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MISEM members and associates about their recent and ongoing research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today it is my great pleasure to meet and talk with Maria Vargha about her research into the period of early Christianization on the periphery of what became to be known of the Holy Roman Empire. Maria is the Assistant Professor of Spatial Approaches to Medieval Studies at the Department of History, University of Vienna. Her publications and research concentrates mainly on social and religious history, landscape and burial archaeology, and the material culture of the High Middle Ages using methods from the digital humanities, principally GIS and network analysis. Maria's research looks at the process of Christianization in Central Europe in the 11th and 12th century and the power relationships demonstrated within the landscape. She does this by plotting the location of castles, monasteries, churches, and burial grounds on a map of the physical geography of the region in question, and then does a lot of very clever analysis. Her results for this work for Hungary were published in a monograph, Modelling Christianization, published in 2022 jointly by Archaeolinga Budapest and Archaeo Press, Oxford. Maria has worked on a similar project for the Czech Republic and has co-edited a forthcoming publication entitled Power in Numbers, being the collected papers from conferences on the role of rural populations in the Christianization and state formation. This is due to be published this year by Brepols. Since January 2024, Maria has been running a 5-year project entitled Relic, funded by the ERC STG, to expand this interesting work to other parts of Central Europe. Maria, welcome to the MISEM podcast.
Hello, Karen, and thank you for having me. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. I would just like to add one little thing. The Czechia part, I don't want to take the credit all for myself because it was a wonderful, wonderful group project, which then continued into a second bigger group project, which is now led by my wonderful colleague Ivo Stefan. So it was an absolute team effort. But thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you for coming in. And I can see from the way you're talking about it, you had great fun doing the Czechia project.
That's true.
Okay, let's go back to a recent publication of the Hungarian work. In that book, which covered the Christianization of Hungary, you said that the state was not interested in the actual conversion of the peasantry, but King István still ordered churches to be built throughout the kingdom. I found this quite strange, so I'd like to know, why did he do this? And everyone who listens to our podcast will know that Pavel Figurski's recent podcast talked about Polonia in the same period and said that there was a law that everyone had to attend church every week, where the names of the king and the country were invoked and instilled a sense of national identity. Was it the same in Hungary?
Actually, we have the same laws for Hungary. I think what is the difference here, or where we have to make a difference, is between conversion of the individual and the institutionalized Christianization of the people. And the latter is what was in the interest of the king. And the second part, the individual conversion of, let's say, a peasant in a little village, did not concern the king, even though, of course, we had these laws about attending the church. There were even minor regulations, which are very funny, which is about those who are murmuring or whispering during the Holy Mass and how they should be punished. These laws went into really minor details. But what I think is that the ruler was concerned more of the bigger picture, this institutionalized Christianization, and not on the individual conversion of a certain person.
But by sharing their authority over the rural population with the church, it sounds like they were giving part of their authority away.
I don't think so, especially when you think about the institutionalized part of the system, where they gain the power, where they gain the control, is by these churches, which are overseeing the people. But what they are doing individually or how they are having their beliefs is a very personal thing. And it's not something that we as archaeologists or historians can uncover, especially when we are talking about the rural population, the everyday people, of whom we don't really have any kind of historical sources. And the archaeological sources are simply not quite good enough to have definite answers to these questions. So it's not about giving away the power to the people or not about giving away the power to the church. It's about following an idea, which is Christianization, becoming a Christian king, joining to the Christian West, and setting up the principles for that, in which the people will be integrated. And that is the important part, and that is how the power of the ruler is supported by this process.
So in some ways the church acted like the local municipality town hall.
Yes, that's my idea.
Got it. Now it makes sense.
Cool.
So thinking on that, and I know from many, many places, it's always been assumed that when the king is baptized, he converts to Christianity, the whole country is Christian. Obviously, as you have implied, it really wasn't. So how likely is it that Christian beliefs and pagan beliefs continued at the same time, probably in the same place and within the same person?
It's absolutely possible. To start with some example for the latter, if you talk about apotropic practices, which are going on throughout the Middle Ages, we have these weird things in churchyard cemeteries in the High Middle Ages, sometimes even later. My favorite example for this are these kind of sacrificial vessels. These are little ceramic pots, which are sometimes buried under buildings, with some animals, baby animals, so like kittens or puppies or sometimes fish. And you have these with churches. And this is happening much later on. So I think that this kind of conflicting beliefs within a person is very much present. And our view of the past cannot be completely black and white, just because our sources are quite black and white. We have been humans, always. And I think humans are never black and white. So this is one thing. And to answer the second half of the question, I think it's absolutely very much possible. We see this kind of different practices at the same time. There is a kind of transition period. And of course, in different places, or sometimes even in the same places, people have different practices in the archaeological material, so in the burial material. So it's definitely happening, and it's really, really hard to grasp it archaeologically in a very punctual, chronological way. We cannot, go into the decades of when is exactly changing and happening, but it is very much present.
I come from England, and many of the older churches were built on pagan sites, because you had the path there, you had the psychology of going there at certain times. Was it the same here in Central Europe?
It can happen. It doesn't always happen, but it can happen. We have examples from various places in Central Europe for that. Not necessarily pagan sites. What is also very prevalent is, for example, Roman ruins. But some sort of lieu de mémoire can be present, even with a previous burial place, which did not have a church. And then a church was erected there and the burials continued. So we have multiple sites actually for that shows that this thing is happening. But the question is always whether we can call the previous site pagan. In some cases, yes, absolutely, there is evidence for that it's not Christian. I prefer to use that to pagan. But in other cases, we don't know. It might just have been a cemetery without a church, and we have absolutely no idea about the beliefs of the people who were buried there.
Your previous and your new work focuses on archaeological research and uses big data techniques to analyse everything. Now, archaeology mostly focuses on detail. It will excavate a grave, a single grave, or a midden site. I used to get the midden sites. How do you manage this balance between the archaeological detail and the big data approaches.
So we are even taking this a little bit further because we even want to integrate historical data into this big pool. And the issue with archaeological data is that it's very, very different. Every site is different. Our approach is that we want to integrate everything that we know, which means that we have in our data set even those sites which are only known from field surveys and those that have been excavated and published and analyzed absolutely properly. And we do it in a way that we have a multi-level data base for that, which can handle both of these situations. This is developed by my brilliant colleague Stefan Eichert, who is the leader of the team of this ERC project at the Naturhistorisches Museum here in Vienna. And they are responsible for the Austrian data and the integration of all of the data into this wonderful database, which is based on their previous work, Thanatos. Thanatos is the archaeological and anthropological date of early medieval burials in Austria. And what it does is that it records all the published sites, and you can compare everything, every feature, every phenomena, every object that has been in any grave of any of these cemeteries. So this is a very detailed level. And we are aiming for this with those sites that have been published and analyzed and well known. And we are aiming for the lower level, the site level data, for those where we know less. And then we bring the historical data into the picture, which is sometimes, again, very detailed, and in others, we know very little about it. So this kind of magic tool, the database based on Thanatos, is the one that is the answer to this question. So this is how we can solve this, because this way we can integrate everything and analyze it on different levels.
That is going to be a mighty database.
Yes, you can say that it's a database of networks on multiple levels.
Moving on to your new research project funded by the ERC STG, we know it builds on your previous research, but what are the new questions you're asking? And we know something of your information sources, being the archaeology, but what are your sources of the historical information?
So actually the novelty of this new research comes directly from this Thanatos database integration, because previously what we have been able to do was only to analyze the networks of sites, so site level research. And now we really want to penetrate deeper into the data and see how the individual comes in. So we can go from the level of sites to the level of individual. We can compare the burial customs. We can compare the objects in the graves. We can integrate that into the big networks that we are uncovering with the analysis of the sites themselves. So this is the biggest novelty, and this is where we can not only see this kind of bigger processes that are going on the country level. Let's say, how much centralization do we see in the development of the lowest institution of the church, so the lowest ecclesiastical network? But we can also see how it's happening within the given sites, because we can see these differences in the burial customs. We can see these minor details that are so important for us archaeologists. And with the integration of the historical data, we can actually bring in another element which is archaeologically very problematic, and that is settlements. Because the settlement data in archaeology is very dependent on the regional research level. So there are regions where it's very intensively researched, then we would have much more data. In others, where it's not so much in the focus and we have much less data. So the taxonomy of the settlement data is very different, and therefore not very good to be used in such an analysis. Whereas if we are going for certain types of settlements that are appearing in historical sources, that's a completely different thing, and that we can analyze actually better.
And I guess it's the amount of archaeology that's been done in a certain region, isn't it? And if you've got loads of archaeology, you've got loads of data.
Of course, yeah.
No archaeology, no data.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not really complementing that. So what we want to research with this historical data of settlements is toponyms as well as mentions in historical charters. And my idea is to go into this direction because in the Hungarian material, I had this idea that the lowest ecclesiastical network might be connected to this royal curia system of the ruler who had this itinerant kingship, which means that he moved between these curias, which had probably the first churches and might have influenced the development of the network around them. And we know that this curia system, at least in Hungary, in other parts it's debated, but we are researching it, is connected with certain type of settlements, which we call service settlements. And we have toponymic data of this. And on top of that, we have some sort of historical data on them. They appear in charters and the services appears in charters and so on and so forth. So this is a very special kind of historical data or historical and geographic data that we can compare to the archaeological data. So this actually checking a hypothesis and see whether this works in the other parts that we are examining, or this is something that is unique for Hungary.
You mentioned service settlements. What kind of service?
I think probably the most common example that you would get for that is the smiths, the villages of the smith. And this happens, of course, everywhere. So you have this kind of toponyms all over Central Europe. And what is really exciting is that, for example, in the case of Hungary, wherever there was archaeological research in such villages, you did find traces of iron production. And now we're not talking about the one smith that is always in the village, but iron smelting, which is, I think, a very different kind of thing. Because there are many, many other kind of services. We even know, for example, from charters that there were certain people who were responsible for the services of the inner chambers of the king. We would never find archaeological traces of that, right? But for example, this kind of metal production is something that is really easy to find. But you also have cooks, you also have, those who are dealing with the horses and so on and so forth. So it's a very wide range of services that appear in the toponymic and historical records, and some of it can be also checked archaeologically.
I just hadn't thought about all these services which would be peripheral to the king.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't know if it has been like that in all countries, but maybe we will find out.
I know I said at the beginning of this interview that you take all the data and then you do some very clever analysis. Could you tell us how you do this? Perhaps through some examples of the factors that you use in the research, which are obviously very, very wide, and how you use them and interpret those to show the religio-political events and developments. And then you interpret those events and developments to show the relationship between the rural people, the peasants, and the secular and religious elites. How do you do that?
So to make it simple, it comes down to two things: proximity and catchment analysis, which in English means that what we are looking for is who is close to whom and what kind of areas of influence we can discover. So what we are checking, both within the landscape when possible and without the landscape, the physical landscape, when it's too large of a territory, for example, and the computer cannot handle it, is that what kind of networks we can see between certain sites, for example, a network of churches, which is, of course, will be only a hypothetical one because there's lots of data that we cannot uncover, but this is the best we can get. And how that relates to other things, such as the proximity of central power points, such as castles, or ecclesiastical power centers, such as monasteries, or cathedrals, and so on and so forth. And so what we are analyzing with that is to see how much the central powers, whether it be secular or ecclesiastical, influences the development of this church network. So we want to see if the proximity of the king or one of his proxies is helping the development of these networks, meaning that near such a power center, there would be a very big density of churches, and where is no power center, we see no churches, or on the contrary. And it doesn't always have to be the king who is there, right? So it can be a monastery. Or in other parts where the power is not as centralized as it seems to be in the case of Hungary, we can see what other players are in there. So are there local lords who are promoting Christianizations? Are there monasteries who's promoting those monasteries? So we can uncover the back players of this and see whether we see an organic development maybe. Or we see something that is coming from the top, which is like encouraged from the top, so to say. And these are the dynamics, the power dynamics in the landscape, which we are interpreting and analyzing.
But you've implied you often don't know exactly where the church was. How do you guess where the churches were?
Actually, from archaeological data, we know the locations of the churches. The historical data is sometimes much harder to localize exactly. So that can be an issue. But especially because of that, we mostly work with data which can be localized very precisely. And when we are talking about such large regions and an entire country, then, for example, if we know that something was within a certain village, but we don't know where exactly within that village was, it doesn't influence the big picture so much. But we are actually striving for the most punctual location as possible, especially because of the nature of the analysis.
So you're looking at church hierarchies and power hierarchies, because you've got the castle and the monasteries and their relationship with the local churches. Is that right?
Yes, it's right. So we are searching the relationships between these local entities, the local churches, and these kind of centers of power, the monasteries or the castles or the curias of the king, and so on and so forth, which definitely has some sort of hierarchy, because what we are most interested in is the churches of the everyday people. That's the lowest.
Yeah.
So anything above that absolutely represents some sort of hierarchical system.
Do you expect the whole region to have the same kind of hierarchy and relationship between the elites and the peasants? Or do you think it would change between different parts of the region, perhaps where you had Roman Catholic influence or Byzantine influence?
So I think the hierarchy is quite the same in all the region. I cannot say that it's entirely the same because the church law, which influences the actual hierarchy of churches, is not yet there. So it's basically from the 13th century onwards only when we can call parishes parishes, and when these kind of more intricate hierarchies are developed in church law. In the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries that we are talking about, even the denomination of the churches are very different in sources. So it can be anything. But if we are just talking on the hierarchy level, like a lower local church network, and then monasteries, which represent a higher power station, and some sort of secular power seats, let it be a king or lords or similar. Yes, these are very similar in the entire region. And this is good because this allows us to analyze the power dynamics in the same manner. But I do not expect them to be the same all over in the region. That would be weird, because my preconception is that the different kind of secular power dynamics will result in a different dynamics on the landscape of the local churches as well. So the power is not always super centralized, and that should be shown. And then the timeline of the Christianization of the people is also quite different in the different regions. So In other places, starts in the 9th century, in the 8th century. So when we are talking about 10th century and 11th century systems, they can be very different. And the motives can be very different as well. So whereas in Hungary, we might see some sort of more centralized system, we can expect that in other parts of the region, it can be more of a down to top. So it was a local initiative, for example.
So when you see the bottom, the local initiative coming through, you're expecting to see a different spatial relationship?
Yes, a different spatial relationship. And this is where this new project comes in, when we can also compare the burial customs and whether we see differences in these cases to the contemporaneous, but different power dynamic networks.
That will be absolutely fascinating when it comes out.
Thank you.
You've talked quite a lot about the output being the database, and it sounds like you're going to need a supercomputer to use that database. It sounds like it's going to be so massive and so interesting. So for my final question, I wonder if there are any other similar big data, open access databases available for medieval history or history in general. Are they widely available? Are they known? Are they much used? And how will you promote the existence and how to use your database?
So I can assure everybody that to use the database, you don't need a supercomputer. What you need a supercomputer for is to analyze all the data, which is our second phase, right? And for the best comparable open access data set is what I mentioned, Thanatos, which everybody can check at thanatos.net. And it's an amazing, really mind-blowing data set, which is there to use for everybody and has been developed by Stefan Eichert and Nina Richards, who were the PIs of these projects. And I think it is now quite well known because they have been very successful at advertising it. And what I'm going to do for ours is the same thing. So I will go to conferences and show it around to people to use. And I will come to podcasts like this. And thank you so much again for having us. And I will talk about this. So people, our data set is not yet available. Give us a year and we will put it online. And basically, the second part is if we want a public outreach. And that's a different story. But we are very committed to that as well. So there are two things to be considered with this. One is the data that we are working with is not only published data, but also archival data. Archival data in different countries has its own restrictions, which we of course have to be compliant with. So there will be different availability access to our data, different for the public and different for researchers, because it's very understandable that not everybody wants to know the exact location of archaeological sites, for example, because that leads to other problems, right? But we would like to communicate this to the public as well, because we don't only want to have this data set on the website, but we would like to also showcase some of the shorter interpretations of some of our analysis. And we would like to have this kind of short articles or descriptions which would be more digestible for the general public as well, so that we can communicate this process not only for the scientific but for the public community as well.
I love the idea of ordinary members of the public being able to access this data. That's really where my heart is. I just want to have people able to think about the past as it affects them. And this will help, I'm absolutely sure.
That is so lovely. Thank you.
And on that very positive note, we will have to conclude this very, very interesting conversation. Maria, thank you for coming in and sharing your knowledge, your information, your enthusiasm, and thanatos.net with us.
Thank you so much, Karen. Soon, relic.something will come as well.
Today, I have been talking with Maria Vargha about her recent and ongoing research into castles, churches, cemeteries, and how Central Europe became Christian. I hope you found it as interesting and enjoyable as I did. Please do look out for the next MECEM podcast, in which we talk to MECEM members and associates about their recent or ongoing research into medieval Central Europe. And if you or your colleagues are doing research and you would like to talk about it with other MECEM members, please do contact me through the MECEM board or MECEM website administrator. In the meantime, I'm Karen Culver for the MECEM podcast. Thank you. Until the next time, goodbye.